Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our lecture with Professor Ebrahim Moosa on critical traditionalism in Islamic thought, history, norms, and interpretation. Professor Moosa is the Mirza Family Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. He co-directs the Contending Modernities Project, a global research and educational initiative examining the interaction among Catholic, Muslim, and other religious and secular forces in our world. His work is focused on the mutation of Islamic thought in history, with special attention to law, theology, philosophy, and a special focus on the study of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. He's the author of Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination, What is a Madrasa, and most recently forthcoming by Cambridge University Press in the Element series, a book on the encounter between Islamic theology and science. I first discovered Professor Moosa's work and his writings via his commentaries on the late, great Fazlur Rahman. Since that time, we've remained in touch, and I've deeply benefited from his scholarship, his public intellectual work, and especially the life lessons that he has learned in terms of Islamic ethics as an activist in South Africa during the struggle against apartheid. Professor Moosa has been described by other scholars in the field of Islamic studies as, quote, one of the most important and prominent intellectual theoreticians behind progressive Muslim thought. According to Khalid Abu Fadl at UCLA, Dr. Moosa is, quote, a formidable Muslim intellectual and scholar. It's a huge honor to have him on our campus today to speak on the topic of critical traditionalism in Islamic thought, history, norms, and interpretation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Moosa to Georgetown.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Professor Hashmi, for introducing me, and my thanks to all the sponsors and co-sponsors of this event. It's always a great pleasure to be with Nadia. I remember almost 2 decades ago, all the great, fun, exciting stuff we used to do, and I'm very happy to see you at Georgetown and wish you the very best in advancing the projects that you so supremely promote. So today I want to talk about critical traditionalism. And, you know, as Professor Hashmi was talking about what my good friend, Professor Khalid Abul Fadl, calls me a progressive. Some people say I'm a modernist. And each one of these labels carries some weight. So if you say you're a modernist, then people say, are you buying all the aspects of modernity, right? What about modernity? So what is the telos of modernity? Where is it going? Okay, and you don't have a good answer to that. And if you say you're a progressive, then progressive in what sense? Okay. So all these labels count, and I find that the orientation to which I'm moving, and I'm in between multiple places, is critical traditionalism, and hopefully I'll give you a slice and some insight into what I mean by that. Someone recently asked me, what is the elevator pitch of this talk that you are going to give? I said, I want to talk about tradition, history, norms, and values in Islam. And this is a social science colleague. And so he looked at me a little bit puzzled. So I said, okay, you want the bumper sticker version of it, right? He said, yeah, give me that. So I said, well, tradition has a vote in the making of norms and value, but history has a veto. Tradition has a vote in the making of norms and values, but history has a veto. That phrase adapts a saying of Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstruction Judaism, who remarked that Jewish law has a vote but not a veto. Kaplan meant that precedent should guide but not paralyze decision. My revision adds that history itself occasionally exercises a veto. Even sacred norms are born in time, and history recalls these norms to accountability. So I think that this notion of critical traditionalism is a current of Islamic thought that maybe is forgotten. It's a self-reflexive way of inhabiting tradition without becoming a prisoner of tradition. It's a way of inhabiting tradition without becoming its prisoner. Critical traditionalism treats tradition as discursive, meaning it's argumentative. It's about debates, it's about arguments. It is lived and revisable. A continuing conversation about meaning rather than a museum of verdicts. So it's about meaning making. The word madhab is the first concept I want to tackle, as defined by Murtada al-Zabidi, a scholar of Indian heritage, and most people have forgotten that he's of Indian heritage, who ended up in Egypt and became one of the most important figures. He's also a student of the famous Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, and he says the word madhab. Now, the word madhab, very quickly, in the through the help of anthropology, people like Talal Asad and others, we now begin to think about madhab not as a right in law, but as a discursive tradition. Okay, so it could be a discursive tradition in theology, a discursive tradition in law. It could be in any argument is a madhab, and I'll tell you. For instance, there's a famous either a hadith, a prophetic saying, or a statement that people say ustur dhihabaka wa dhahabaka wa madhabak. Protect and hide your journey. In the medieval times, you don't tell people your journey, otherwise you could be waylaid. So hide your travel, your journey, your goal that you might be carrying, and your destination. You don't want thieves waiting for you at the destination and emptying your pockets. So madhab really means a destination, an intellectual destination, a spiritual destination, an orientation. So Zabidi, for instance, is also a major lexicologist. He talks about it's a firmly held belief to which one often returns, a path, a tariqa, a source, an asl, a source, an asl, and therefore it's a discursive tradition. Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, in a work, and I know some people might raise it, but Montgomery Watt and Asin Palacios have raised some questions about Mizan al-Amal, which I'm not entirely convinced of, and I can, if you have any questions about that, to say that it is, half of it is Ghazali, but there's a pseudo hand going in that is reorganized. That in an article that is forthcoming, I engage with that charge in greater detail. But Ghazali argues that the word madhab is multivocal. It carries several meanings. And he distinguishes three senses of the word madhab. Oh, it's multivocal. A madhab in the sense that it is a tradition, a solidarity, that you align with the group. So he says your ethnicity, your linguistic community. He actually uses the word your asabiya. He actually uses the word asabiya, meaning your solidarities that you have, that are of a biological, geographical, linguistic nature. That is also a madhab. Those things that bind you. Okay. He also sees that as a question, as a term of subjectivity, especially when you get confidential guidance, the kinds of things we do with our graduate students. We tell them all kinds of things and tell them, don't say that immediately publicly. This is specially designed for you. The exchange between teacher and student, and yeah, he's talking also about spiritual guidance that you get, that every novice gets different kinds of spiritual guidance. He calls that also to be a madhab, that between you and your teacher, and that arrangement that you have of how your teacher is going to deal with you and the kind of advice you get and how you're going to respond to that. He says that could also be a certain kind of as a space for an exercise of subjectivity, because it's a formation of subjecthood, formation of your identity. And then he says a tradition or madhab is its discretion, the convictions a person acquires through reflection and spiritual labor. When you want to now put out those things out there, you say, this is my madhab, right? And that's how in Islamic law, the various law schools, the Sunni Shia law schools, all called madhab, that is basically the convictions that major scholars in the past put out there and their disciples. So in the last sense, madhab is the harvest of disciplined thought, not an inherited badge. And towards the end of that book, Ghazali has a very interesting statement. He says, avoid relying on that's his last two paragraphs. So he goes through this whole discussion. A very important part of this book is about reason. Another part of this book is about sloth and slothfulness, and what in the monastic tradition is called assidia, and to be assiduous, in other words, that term where you develop slothful habits. And he says that if you do not, so that's a whole section. That's the heart of the book, in one sense. And I've also something forthcoming on that whole question about subjectivity and selfhood. But the closing of the book is this, what I think is a clarion call. And you can all see it. I'm not going to read it out for you, but he's urging us to find the truth through inquiry. You yourself should become an owner of a perspective, of a point of view, of a judgment. And he says there is no salvation except in istiqlal al-fikr, in independence of thought. I've also cited this in great detail in my book Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination. And elsewhere, he also in the same long paragraph says, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَشُقْ لَمْ يَنْظُرْ وَمَنْ لَمْ يَنْظُرْ لَمْ يُبْصِرْ وَمَنْ لَمْ يُبْصِرْ بَقِيَ فِي الْعَمَى وَالْحَيْرَةِ. Whoever never doubts, never inquires. Whoever never inquires, never sees. Whoever never sees remains blind and perplexed. Okay, I'm actually astounded. That 20th century Nahda thinkers, the Arab Nahda thinkers, who talk about the Arab, revival of thought and so on, they make Ghazali the scapegoat for everything that goes wrong in Islamic tradition. Ghazali and Sufism. It's the most bizarre, reductive, anti-intellectual statement I've ever found. And it's very difficult to convince. Obviously, people haven't read. Now, because Ghazali has all kinds of other things, so, that he might have said that people have exception to, especially his critique of the Muslim philosophers, which was a strong critique. But that doesn't mean that he's unusable and he's anti-reason. But the historiography, this what I call scapegoat historiography, that is emerged in the Arab world, and a lot of people in the non-Arab world is buying into that, is that the intellectual decline, whatever that means, of Muslim thought has been because of Ghazali, the attack on philosophy, the end of reason. And the other sin that Ghazali had committed was that he fell in love with Sufism, and Sufism, especially popular Sufism, had killed the minds of people. People went going to and visiting shrines and other kinds of things, people getting into practice, and therefore a whole range of supernatural forms of thinking has entered into Muslim thought, and therefore the rest you can conclude from that. So doubt for Ghazali is not the enemy of faith. Coming back to the Ghazali duet, it is the beginning of vision. As Al-Mutanabbi put it, and here is the further slide of Ghazali, and Al-Mutanabbi put it, and Ghazali quote Mutanabbi. Mutanabbi says, Ghazali says, once you begin to find your own feet in understanding, forget what you've heard and hold fast to what you see. For when the sun rises, what need have you of Saturn? So tradition then is a light for seeing, not a chain for binding. Okay. Now, the next section is about history and modernity. The encounter between tradition and modernity has been the most disruptive and revealing experience of the last 2 centuries. Colonial and technological modernities reordered not only Muslim life worlds, but the life worlds around the world. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but if you read the novels of, say, the Indonesian novelist Pramudia Anantatur, Pramudia, for instance, depicts in his novels of colonial Java. where subsistence farmers who once grew rice for their households were forced to plant sugar for European markets. Within a generation, moral economy shifted, families lost their cuisines, and patriarchy itself was re-engineered. And very interestingly, because of poverty, and I can't go, I'd be tempted to go into this novel, but because of poverty, many families then turned their daughters, out of poverty, into concubines for Dutch overlords living there. And through that concubinage, women start getting power and owners of money because they inherited that from the spouses, who were more or less like a decade or two or three, older than them, and they could then develop capital. Very interesting sort. So anyway, what I'm saying, whatever way and whatever the intent and the ways in which societies have been re-engineered, when conditions change, the grammars or the grammar of norms do change with them. The grammar of norms. When conditions change, the grammar of norms inevitably change. And I'm not entirely sure whether people who want to return back to tradition think that they can reinvent the tradition that has died. Once the conditions on the ground have changed in substantial ways, it's impossible to revert back. Now, Ibn Khaldūn understood this dynamic with unmatched clarity when he talks about that the inner meaning of history involves investigation, verification of truth, and subtle causal analysis of events. And therefore he argues that history is rooted in philosophy. That's it. The word he uses is hikmah, and he doesn't use the word falsafa, but he uses philosophy because he thinks about wisdom as part of philosophy, and thus deserves to be counted among the disciplines of philosophy. Someone like R.G. Collingwood, for instance, would say, we try to understand ourselves and our world only so that we may learn how to live. History, in other words, is a training in living wisely in time. Antonio Gramsci, for instance, the neo-Marxist, adds that the present, quote, the present is a criticism of the past, besides and because of surpassing it. The present is a criticism of the past, besides and because of surpassing it. We discard only those aspects of the past that the present has intrinsically criticized and therefore outgrown. This is the sense in which history has a veto. Some norms cease to speak for us because we ourselves have become different. Yet the work of discerning this difference and of owning the present is itself historical labor. Religious institutions that fail, or traditions that fail to own the present, cannot guide it. In my view, and I study, traditionalist ulama scholarship largely in South Asia, the Middle East, and so on, this is the biggest issue of that tradition, that the inability to understand the present. Various attempts, 1872, Ali Mubarak Pasha, Minister of Public Works in Egypt, built Darul Kutub al-Masriya, the big archive, and also Darul Uloom. Darul Uloom was meant to be an institution that's going to familiarize the best graduates of Al-Azhar with modern science, humanities, social science, so they can bring the two worlds together. It turned out to be not a very successful experiment. However, in South Asia, I found that individual traditionalists, someone like Maulana Lutfullah Aligari, who dies in the early part of the 20th century, for instance, and I mention him in the book on science and theology, he is open, and people like Habibul Habibullah Khan Sherwani are open to those kinds of ideas of bringing the two worlds together. And Sherwani plays a very big role in Nadwatul Ulama, for instance, the institute where I graduated from. So, practice precedes understanding is my next section. From Ghazali, Ibn Khaldun, and Gramsci, we learn a common principle. Practice precedes understanding. People live their moral intuitions before codifying them into law. Revelation enters a world already full of habits, virtues, and customs. To observe this process, we turn to a 10th century linguist who thought anthropologically before anthropology existed. His name is Abul Fath Uthman ibn Jinni. Ibn Jinni, who dies in the year 1002, is a Mosul-born grammarian of Greek descent, devoted his life to the study of language. He's very, very famous. Yet hidden in his philological discussions are reflections on law and morality that illuminate the social roots of Sharia. So this quote, I'm going to break it down in smaller pieces to basically share with you how I read him and what kind of insight he offers us. He begins with the notion of illah. Illah is a cause or a rationale. Grammarians speak of the ilal of Nahu, that is the rationale or the reasons of why Arabic grammar is, in text particular form, why you say certain things in u, why you say why you say e, why the endings of them. Jurists, Muslim jurists also talk about the ilal al-ahkam, that is the ratios, the causes behind certain rules. Illah. So Ibn Jinni goes through a very interesting, reflection there. He says, he asks whether the causes of grammar or the rationale of grammar resemble those of theology, or does it resemble those of law? His answer is, the causes of grammar are akin to those of theology, because both rely on observation and reason, whereas the causes of law are moral and cultural. The illah of law practices are moral and cultural. This distinction opens the door to a reflection on how law grows from life. Ibn Jinni first discusses the unavenged blood feuds of pre-Islamic Arabia. He reasons that the Quranic rules of retaliation, qisas, and blood money, diya, were revealed to discipline vengeance and preserve life through pardon or measured retribution. Let me just see if I put those slides somewhere else. No, something had happened to the slides that I was breaking down this, but it's fine. I should be good enough to talk to you about. I thought I was going to make it easier, but nevertheless. So one of the things he talks about are these, well, he talks about the unavenged blood feuds of pre-Islamic Arabia and the reasons the Quranic rules of retaliation, qisas, and blood money and diya were revealed to discipline vengeance and preserve life through pardon or measured retribution. Now he says law entered an existing moral landscape. It refined rather than created virtue. That's an interesting observation, that the law, and unfortunately how modern people think that this is God's law, so it came from heaven. These laws were already on the ground. The virtues were already there. He then says that even devotional duties, that is ibadat, he writes, have social purpose. On pilgrimage, for instance, he says, pilgrimage is undertaken as an obligation so that it can be durbatun linnasi ala ta'a, a habituation of people to obedience. And he says that the journey that you travel at great length to undertake the pilgrimage That journey trains endurance and sustains communal solidarity. And then comes his most striking claim. He says, all this, the examples that he gave you of how Islamic laws were already there, or the one that he talks about ibadat, or he talks about another Arab custom, the custom of granting asylum. The Quran ratifies that practice of asylum, and the verse goes like this: if a polytheist seeks your protection, grant him protection until he hears the word of God, then escort him to where he feels safe. So he says this practice, even without the verse, Ibn Jinni says, honorable people would have done the same. Law here, the Quranic expression and support for that practice, he says, dignifies existing nobility in people. It's not something new that it originates. From these reflections, three insights emerge. But before I share those three insights, Ibn Jinni says something very interesting. He says, there's even another example he gives. Chastity and paternity. Ibn Jinni continues, he says, that the norms of chastity and paternity were honored among Arabs long before Islam. If a man, for instance, doubted a child's paternity, he might act from character. He might act from character, from moral dignity, not from textual command. He would have some under that from his character make the judgment. So, Ibn Jinni says such a virtue was not prescribed by an unambiguous text, nor by a revelation. Moral excellence precedes revelation, and revelation sanctifies it. Goodness was not invented by the Quran. The Quran dignified the good already alive in people's hearts. And it is, there's a famous hadith that says, الناس معادن. خياركم في الجاهلية خياركم في الإسلام. الناس معادن. The best of you in pre-Islam are the best of you in Islam. Human beings are like quarries, right? They are like quarries of, precious minerals and wealth. But you must do إذا فقهوا. But you must apply your thinking process. Okay? So with these examples, the interesting thing that he says that all these things are already in people's hearts and people's mind, and he implies, therefore, people were moral before they were Muslim. Revelation confirmed what conscience already knew. Those are the habits of the heart that Tocqueville would later celebrate. From these reflections, three insights emerge. One, revelation dignifies existing moral labor. Two, practice precedes understanding. And three, custom, culture, and revelation are braided together. Revelation is both top-down confirmation or dignifying existing practices, and bottom-up. We can put it another way, a dialogue between heaven and history. Very much connecting with what Ibn Jinni said, almost 700 years later, 760 years later, Shah Waliullah dies in 1762 in Mughal India. He also revisits this question in one of his very important books. It's called God's Conclusive Argument, Hujjatullah al-Baligha. And he struggles with this question about laws that were given at a particular time in history, and how do people follow that. And this has been also a subject of a great, this point and this statement of his has been subject of a great deal of argument and discussion, because this section of the book starts from under the heading of how a prophet lawgiver arranges society. And this prophet and lawgiver ideally should arrange the law based on the practice of all the communities he would be serving. But because people do not follow prophets at the drop of a hat, it takes a lot of time. The prophet makes his community's practice the base practice, the founding practice. Now the quandary is all these other communities that later come into this prophet's community and tradition after the prophet dies, their practices, their norms are vastly different. And how do you accommodate this? When the world was, from the 7th century onwards till about, say, 1500s, there was fairly uniformity in the, as Hodgson would say, in the Afro Asian ecumeny, agrarian societies, some pastoral societies, their kind of practice were arranged in that way. But I think after 1400, the world begins to change, practices alter. But even in that previous period, these practices were changing so much that when Islamic law goes into Central Asia, they have to do a whole lot of new kinds of interpretation. Okay? And no wonder when you get Salafis, people who want to now go to this first 200 years, they're going to find the interpretations of the law schools vastly different from these original statements attributed to the Prophet, attributed to early Muslims. They say, oh my God, this is a complete different page. And then they get shocked. And then they say the biggest conspiracy in Islam are these law schools, right? This is what Salafists attack. The first, but they do not understand that the earliest generation understood the world through the worldliness of the text. The worldliness of the text. Okay? And the text was not disconnected from the world. Therefore, it is so important that when you do tafsir, you need to understand what is the backstory to the tafsir. And how does it fit into a world there? Or if there is no backstory, you need to do a lot more work to understand what does this really mean, okay? And unfortunately, since we are in the world of everybody's literate, everybody can read a translation, you have now a huge industry of what I call, do-it-yourself Islam, the Home Depot version, right? And that means everybody's now empowered to do interpretation, and you have a huge amount of confusion, and that indicates to you that this tradition has been fractured. The tradition is fractured very seriously, and the sad part is that those who are seen to be the repositories of the tradition, the ulama, they are unable to deliver that tradition in its next instantiation. So Waliullah struggles with the same issue. And he says, why do people obey law across generations? The first generation, he said, follows the law because of its fit. It fits their circumstances, right? It meets all the needs. Later generations follow the law because they want to belong. They want to belong to Team Islam. You see what I'm saying? Hence, and then he says, in a very interesting way, he says, there's nothing more fitting or easier than the Prophet's law, Sharia, should take into account the customs of his own people in its rights, penal rules, and social arrangements. I think we all agree on that. That's Ibn Jinni helps us out a great deal to understand that. Nor should it impose extreme restriction upon later generations who come after them, but rather should show compassion toward them in general. Now, many people make an error in this key word, but they read the sentence and says, يَبْقَى عَلَيْهِمْ فِي الْجُمْلَةِ. It is يَبْقَى عَلَى, it doesn't work. It's يُبْقِي عَلَيْهِمْ فِي الْجُمْلَةِ. أبقى يُبْقِي means to show compassion to them. So you need to show compassion to the later generations. And look what he says. For the earlier people find it easy to embrace that law because it accords with the testimony of their hearts and their customary ways, while the later generations find it easy to follow it out of their love and admiration for the conduct of the leaders, the caliphs of the faith. This indeed is a natural phenomenon for every nation in every age, ancient or contemporary. And he also says that you should not, and when he talks about, the previous sentence, when he talks about the rights, penal rules, social arrangements, nor should it impose extreme restriction upon later generations to come upon. Okay, this thing about, and he used the word hudud and sha'air. Hudud means those penal restrictions and so on. And he says you really need to cut people some slack. Now, this is the biggest problem in the 20th century, that all Islamic revivalist movements are saying you need to have Islamic law. And then they want to implement the most draconian version of Islamic law. And there is no comprehension of what world Islamic law is operating in. But that is a sign of authenticity. And in my view, it is the most faux authenticity that you can ever find. So this passage of Shah Waliullah joins Ibn Jinni's moral anthropology and to combines that moral anthropology to Waliullah's ethic of mercy or compassion. Revelation dignifies custom. Compassion preserves it through time. That's the key thing. Revelation dignifies custom, but compassion preserves it through time. In other words, you don't have to follow the same formula throughout time. Compassion will create new kinds of arrangements. The key thing is you need to have a norm. Whether the norm should be that 7th century Arabian norm, that is the key issue. And this has been the struggle in Islamic thought, especially in Islamic law, for a long time. What's my next slide? Okay. So I'm coming to my last few observations. The capacities of critical traditionalism should inculcate is to require at least 4 capacities. There can be many more. I would talk about imagination, dignity, beauty, and complexity. Imagination makes abstract rules of truths visible. Abu Nasr al-Farabi, for instance, defined poetry as the creation of an image in the listener's mind. In theology, imagination allows revelation to converse with science, with the human sciences, with the humanistic traditions, without collapsing into literalism. Imagination is the faculty that keeps faith intellectually vibrant and dignified. Dignity and integrity. Today, modern technology, modern practices, in many ways test the moral idea of trust, amana, because the modern world changes things radically. So when you think about a trust that you've inherited, we always think that the trust must be preserved in the way we found it originally. But we know it is not possible. Life is full of change, alteration. We might have been irresponsible. Environmental catastrophe that we face shows that we've acted irresponsibly. Whether we knew on day one already that this will be, some of these issues are only become available and visible after 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 our experiences. But the principle that we normally apply is, which is a principle of conservation, that averting harm takes precedence over harvesting a benefit, right? It is one of those qawaid, one of those rules, etc. Sometimes I also think that those rules require much more elaboration. How do you measure when you see a visible harm emerging? but there are also 10 other benefits. How do you balance that? For that, you require social science, you require greater complexity. Okay. And so, the ecological and other issues are challenging us, and this question of human dignity. And so I think what we need to think about is stewardship, not domination, might be a key to us dealing with some of our challenges. Beauty, ihsan, this is famous statement that God is beautiful, loves beauty. Beauty disciplines desire and joins form to goodness. The development of an aesthetic imagination is vital to a full and rich life. And that truth must be graceful. Okay. And I think very little attention is paid to the question of beauty. I got several proposals in to think about how do I bring the messages of art, architecture, the humanities to religious scholars, and how can I get those messages into sermons, into mosques, to understand and appreciate beauty. It's a kind of a replica of what I did a couple of years ago, working with ulama in India and Pakistan and teaching them questions of science and Islamic theology that was funded by the Templeton Trust. So I'm now moving in the direction of how do we make art, architecture, aesthetics. How do you bring those messages into the mosque, into the hearts of people, and through practices and so on. Complexity. Knowledge unfolds through systems that are intricate. They're very intricate to produce simple rules for them. So we need to embrace complexity. Classical legal theory had distinguished between probability and zanni, and I think many people working on usul are still stuck to that. These are very vast categories. There are many categories in between. There are levels of epistemic uncertainty that we're also dealing with, and so on. So I'm calling for complexity. And one of the interesting things is Ghazali, for instance, says, right somewhere, إن العلوم كلها إن ميزان العمل إن العلوم كلها متعاونة مترابطة بعضها ببعض. All forms of learning are by their very nature interconnected, interconnected and mutually reinforcing. He says all knowledge is that way, and he says the reason you need to do that is the reason you need to pursue that line is that you do not reject something out of ignorance. In other words, that your ignorance doesn't become the standard of what the reality is in the world. I can think of many instances that I can apply that. I mean, it is so. Muhammad Iqbal has a very interesting insight. He says, and I always use this because I find it quite powerful. He says, an act, Iqbal, for those of you who don't know, is a early 20th century poet philosopher whose burial place is in colonial India, and he's buried in Lahore, and he's claimed by Pakistan as their spiritual father. But Iqbal writes, an act is temporal or profane if it is done in detachment from the infinite complexity of life behind it. An act is temporal or profane if it is done in detachment. In other words, when you ignore the infinite complexity of life behind it, then it is what we would say, it is profane. It is. But he says it is spiritual if it is inspired by that complexity. If you are inspired by the complexity, then that act becomes spiritual. Faith for Iqbal thrives not by escaping complexity, but by engaging it. These capacities create what I call braided thinking. And what I mean by that is that, the humanities, science, law, and theology, each of these are symbol systems, distinct yet intertwined in life. And that's what I mean by braided thinking. On other occasions, I use the metaphor of tradition as a rope that is every every generation adds fibers to that rope. And as you tie, every generation contributes to that rope of tradition with from its own environment, from its own, materials, and creates that rope of tradition. And there are many fibers in a solid and strong rope. So that rope of tradition is also multiple. And so I think about these issues in what I talk about. Theology expresses the God-human relationship, the world relationship. Science, the human-world relation. Humanities provides the skills to find meaning in all this, to live faithfully, is to inhabit all these spheres without collapsing into any one. And the shape of you must think in terms of the metaphor, the shape of a braid, or in terms of symphonic thinking. In the symphony, you have different kinds of people playing different notes to make for the harmony, etc. In conclusion, from Ghazali, Ibn Jinni, and Shah Waliullah, we learn enduring lessons. First, history has a veto. Norms live and die through experience. Second, tradition requires courage. Each generation must become, as Ghazali says, a sahibu madhhabi, an owner of judgment. You need to take responsibility. Third, leadership demands compassion. Law without mercy degenerates into moralism. And Iqbal expressed the spiritual ambition of such critical traditionalism. He says, rise thyself to such heights that God himself may ask man, tell me, what is it that you desire? This is not arrogance, but maturity. The human being taking responsibility before God. In sum, revelation perfects custom, history refines its application. Our task is to sustain that conversation between heaven and history so that faith continues to breathe through imagination, dignity, beauty, and complexity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a seat, Ibrahim. Thank you for the talk and for demonstrating exactly what critical traditionalism is all about. I mean, it's a subject for a forthcoming nice little book that I think would help us all understand exactly what that concept means. I want you to elaborate on two sort of very powerful quotes that you had and bring them together so that we can understand your thesis at a deeper level. You said at the beginning, at the end of your talk, that tradition has a core role in the making of norms and values, but history has a veto. And you also said that when conditions change, the grammar of norms change. Could you elaborate more on exactly what you mean by those statements?
Yeah. So the 2 points that you take on, one was the first one was.
Yeah, the first one was
history.
Tradition has a core role in the making of norms,
yeah.
but history has a veto.
History has veto.
Yeah.
So I think that what I'm trying to say is that history is about experience. So history stands for experience, and tradition stands for continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And the key challenge is, how do you sustain continuity, but when you're going to alter the practice? Because we always think of tradition as a set of practices, right? Mm-hmm. And we are very reluctant to change those practices. Right? And in the pre-modern world, communities and people were not very prone to change. There was no need for change. Mm-hmm. Change would be very incremental and take a long time.
Right.
In the modern world, because of technology, because of a whole range of other kind of materials, I would say materials that dictate our life and our behavior, especially the rise of modern science and technology,
right?
The alteration of our habitat, the alteration of our bodies, right? That is all. Now, we can make judgment calls if that's good or bad, but this is the world we're living in. So, we cannot, so that is the key challenge for all Muslim thinkers from the past, but especially modern Muslim thinkers were challenged by this very issue. And And obviously, the way they did it was the pre-modern Sharia included a whole range of mu'amalat, social practices.
Right.
And those social practices were very much in line with the rhythms and the practices of people. There was hardly any need. Maybe here and there you need to make some kind of change, but
Yeah.
no change in the fundamental Grundnorm,
Right.
as Kelsen would say. You don't have to change a foundational norm because the political economy and all those things are fairly consistent.
Right.
What we are faced is a whole new political economy and new moral economies that are generated by the material conditions. That is no longer sustainable to hold that model of Sharia.
Right.
So what, and I'm sure there are people who want to ask more further questions, but one of the things that modern reformers have talked about, but not sufficiently loudly, is to argue that the core that will not change are the ibadat, the kind of practices of salvation, right? Your salvation, because you could ask, so what is the whole talk that you just gave? What is the difference between why would one adhere to a religion?
Yeah.
Okay, you could just belong to a social club or something of that sort, or a kind of ideology. Well, religion entertains people's concerns about salvation.
Yeah.
Right, and with it comes a form of life. Okay, now the big challenge is that form of life, from its origin, that form of life is no longer viable. Gender question, a whole range of other issues, political governance and so on and so forth.
Citizenship.
From subject to citizenship.
Right.
Okay. What is a human being?
Yeah.
Right. Hierarchy.
Yeah.
Egalitarian. That requires a whole different ontology.
Yeah.
And you cannot accommodate that ontology with that pre-modern frame.
Right.
And therefore, all these things have to be rethought. The quick fix that some people have found, and I sometimes use it and I'm sometimes use it, and Professor Opis is here, so she's the expert on that. The quick fix that people have found, and especially through Islamic revivalist movements, Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat Islami, and all the offshoots, and especially those that have come to the West, the quick fix has been, no, Sharia is pretty. Sharia is very, very pretty. It's about the preservation of 5 big things: preservation of religion, life, property, family, and intellect. Okay, and so any person in this do-it-yourself mode can present it. Sharia is not this mumbo jumbo that these people are talking about, this interpretation of this verse and that hadith and so on and so on. And oh my God, all these hadith are not very, very authentic and so on. But so that's a quick fix, what I call the Band-Aid solution. Okay, and at some point, if you're not going to treat the wound under the Band-Aid, it's going to fester.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that, so that's been the quick fix. So that's the question, your question about, and the question. So we have to take history seriously, and we have to take change seriously.
Yeah.
But we do need tradition. I just recently discovered in volume 22 of the standard edition, Freud talks about that no people can be without a history. No people can be without history, and tradition is absolutely vital. Which is quite eye-opening for me.
Isn't the solution for contemporary Muslims to understand the core ethical values in tradition and then to adapt them in our modern context, which is basically Fazlur Rahman's thesis?
Yeah, but you see, Fazlur Rahman, as much as I love him, he rescued me from my disenchantment with tradition. But I think the modernist project, and the weakness of the modernist project is that it just thinks that you can just make up stuff. You can't make up. You have to engage a tradition, and this engagement with tradition means that you need to deal with the historic tradition, and you have to reinterpret it. You have to work hard to reinterpret. So you need to, in theology, you need a Kalbat amongst the Muslims, right? Who sits and works the theology, the ancient theology into the modern thing. Okay, you need big kind of projects. You need a huge amounts of investment. okay, of time, labor,
Yeah.
scholarship,
Yeah.
to do that. No one in the Muslim world is interested in that.
Yeah.
They want to build big museums.
Yeah.
And they want to buy, very expensive arms,
Yeah.
which they don't know how to use.
Yeah.
And it's it's a sad story.
Yeah.
But those of us who are living,
Yeah.
and here's my hopeful side, those of us living in the West, and we have great universities like yours, and where Islamic studies are taught, and next gen Muslims living here in Europe and other places are very interested in Islam,
Right.
and very interested in studying tradition.
Right.
And I think that's where I see the hope lies. So it's not one big, but incremental, small amounts of work. First of all, the archive of Islamic thought still have to be unpacked.
Right. Yeah.
We only have Ibn Khaldūn,
Yeah.
and he just wrote 6 volumes, and only everybody just reads the first volume if they do.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot of shortcuts. I mean, people like Jabri and Hassan Hanafi and other people have done a lot of work in trying to interpret, but that's just almost a drop in the ocean.
So many more questions. Let me
Yes.
turn to the audience because they've been sitting patiently for about an hour, and the floor is open. If you have any comments, questions, constructive criticisms.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
I love the criticisms.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for the really wonderful and also beautiful delivered lecture. And I want to probe a little bit more on the issue of tradition. I mean, the way you describe the tradition, it was as if it's almost existing in a vacuum. What was missing from my perspective was also how tradition is coming about, and especially the political environment that it is. I mean, the examples you gave by Ibn Jinni is clearly in the 12th, 13th century, because it was a different political environment where certain norms and certain schools of thought were still able to function and still able to pronounce things, whereas later it wasn't the case necessarily anymore. So I'd like you to bring a little bit more how the political landscape is shaping this tradition in order to today looking at how can we make sense of this.
Yeah, excellent question on the political context of tradition.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely a brilliant question, except that it is a stumper. One of the big problems I find is that we don't have enough good Islamic histories of. So, for instance, I worked on Al-Ghazali in the 11th century. You don't get a feel, for instance, how much did people make as professors at the Nizamiya, for instance. You have a clue that when Ghazali, when he leaves his professorship, someone observed that when this guy was when he was inaugurated, he sat on a horse with so many brocades, and it cost so much. And later on, when we saw him X years later, he was living in a very, very, he's now a Sufi, very, very modest clothing. So we get some idea of things, but we don't have good social histories, and therefore people like me are at a disadvantage. And the problem with Islamic study and Islamic law, for instance, so when you're studying Islamic law, you have to do the social history, you have to do the political history, you have to do everything. You can never get and to frame it. So there's a huge gap and vacuum that if someone can point me in the right direction where I could get that, because everything must be done ab initio. You have to do everything by yourself. There's not a thing. So therefore, we count a lot on people like Hodgson and others who've done some really great work. Try to put together, what is the nature of the political economy, the moral economy, and so on and so forth. But we need more. Okay, so, but I think that if I'm now going to, after that apology and indication of my ignorance, I would begin to tackle so the way the political frames the practice. will be relevant. And Islamic law, it's clear that there was Islamic law that was practiced in the courts and Islamic law practiced in the schools, right? Outside the courts. And there was sometimes attention and sometimes collaboration. Now, whether an interpretation, say, in the 13th or 14th century, say, under Ottoman rule, for instance, where the Ottoman state and the Ottoman imperial order and the religious order was very much dominant, right? Whether one would have had a different kind of rationale, a different kind of logic, right? Or would someone like Taj Kubrizadeh or maybe what's his name, the Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam Abu Saud or others. I'm also thinking about another Sheikh al-Islam, Taj Kubrizadeh, no, somebody else. Anyway, would they have done it differently? I suspect, but I do find that they were also fairly innovative, and they would also rely on earlier practices and in doing that. So yes, I do believe the political context is relevant. I think much of the interpretation that is going on today also is because of political context. For instance, the state has a particular religious orientation. The people outside the state, your Yusuf Qaradawi's, your Saeed Ramadan al-Bhuti's, both passed on, and many others in different parts of the world. They giving fatwas, they giving teachings, they trying to work outside the state, trying to keep people's faith in Islam going. So they give certain kinds of interpretation. So for instance, Qaradawi and company, the European Council of Fatwa and Research, as you know, begin to say that a woman who converts to Islam in a fairly good marriage with a non-Muslim husband, she can continue the marriage, right? Whereas the earlier position was a woman cannot be married to a non-Muslim man, right? That was the earlier position. Then they discovered that, the ijma that they claimed, that is the consensus that they claimed that was prevalent, there was not an ijma. The Prophet's daughter was married to a polytheist, and he had visitation rights for her, so the marriage was intact and so on. So a whole range of those issues. Now, I mean, even that rule itself, the way people interpret certain verses and so on, was a rule based in patriarchy. If a society that is moving out of patriarchy aspires to egalitarianism, difference in religion should not be the basis that two people cannot cohabit and have children, have a family. I mean, it might be challenging to raise if you are both religious and you have different kind of religions and so on. I mean, just recently, a woman who is desperate, was desperate to marry a Muslim man, but the Muslim man's father is saying, the Muslim man knows that his father is not going to approve of this marriage, and he says he prefers to be a friend to this woman, but they're not going to find the path to marriage because she's Hindu. And I've been trying to tell her, you might have to find out whether, in India, politically, the Muslims treated Hindus politically as Ahlul Kitab, but not as people of the book, but not for marital purposes. When Akbar married a Hindu woman, it was an outrage, right? But Jahangir also married a Hindu woman, also married a Rajput woman. So all the late Mughal rulers had Rajput mothers and so on. I mean, it's a Zohran Mamdani story.
Yeah.
His
parents.
His father is of a Muslim background, and so that's as we. So yes, I agree. The political context is to be critical. I think my position is already political because I assume a political context. So I'm working for my political context, and because I need to provide some kind of deliverables here. So the political is important, but I do believe that we lack deep archives of the past to indicate change over time.
Yeah, great. Yes, yeah, I'll say.
Well, thanks, Professor. Expanding on the political context, how do you see the contribution of the Shia scholars to the discourse on critical fundamentalism, taking into consideration that the Islamic revolution in Iran is often associated with traditionalism/fundamentalism. And that might lead me to a second question that is mainly conceptual. So when talking about Islamic orthodoxy, the distinction between fundamentalism, traditionalism, authenticity almost come to the forefront. I guess my question is, why do you favor critical fundamentalism over
Critical traditionalism.
critical traditionalism over fundamentalism and authenticity? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, the Iranian context is a very interesting one. The problem I always say to my Iranian and Ithna Ashari and Imami colleagues is, the argument is always that, in Shiism, ijtihad is still alive, and every Ayatollah of repute is a mujtahid and so on. I said, but I don't see you guys producing anything new, different from anybody else. So yes, we can do ijtihad, but the outcomes are not very different. And people are suffering in the Islamic Republic because of a lack of a creative application of Islamic law. It's the same old. But you would find a kind of a brave voice like someone like Jafar Subhani, or decades ago, Baqir al-Sadr began to, think about a little bit outside the box on the theological before Saddam Hussein ended his life.
Montazeri on the Baha'is.
And Muntazari, who was opening his student Mohsin Kadivar, my former colleague at Duke, and so on. So, there are possibilities, but I think everybody is still trapped. Everybody's still trapped in this old tradition of law, that they are not thinking through the questions of law philosophically and historically. You need a kind of a new usul or fiqh based on this new philosophy that I'm talking about, right? So a framing of those issues, which will be epistemological, ontological, questions. Or in Iraq, there are a few scholars who are trying to think about these issues in this way. So I don't see, in terms of quality, any better solutions coming out of either camp. But individuals, they are there, and they have not been institutionalized. I mean, I'm trying to think think about Mujtahid Shabistari, for instance. So Shabistari thinks about theological issues and democracy and human rights. So he's basically interpreted the entire Islamic corpus from his perspective into a human rights discourse. And why is that problematic in my view? Because it's just translation into a Persian idiom, and it is a band-aid kind of fix. In other words, you're trying to find how can you justify human rights, with a modern understanding of human rights. So, for instance, we did a lot more work, for instance, to use the word haqq, which is or huquq al-insan, right? Human rights. So haqq has a genealogy that is very different from rights, modern rights. Haqq means duties more than claims. But in the old system, haqq means duties that makes you eligible to make certain claims on others. It was a reciprocal form of rights. Modern human rights believes that the idea that every human being, so the idea of freedom, for instance, it's a radical idea of freedom. An idea of freedom that breaks with historical notions of freedom. It's a brand new idea of freedom that generates a whole new set of discourses. So just translating hurriya and understanding it as freedom doesn't work, because hurriya in medieval, in pre-modern Islam would mean that you're not a slave. You're a non-slave. Your status can change if there's a war and you're taken as a captive. You could become a slave. And if you think about how jurists write about that, it is a complete transformation of your being into that of a person who's lost freedom. So a lot of these work require a lot of philosophical work. So what has been happening with Muslim modernists and so on, and a lot of us came through that journey and so on, is that Muslim modernists do this quick fix translation. And what I'm now searching for is how do we create more extensive, deliberative scholarship to build, to understand the archive and to build the interpretation. So it requires a whole new reframing. But I also understand the pressures on modern Muslim writers to present solutions. People want, okay, so what does Islam say about that? What is the Muslim response to that? How do you do this? How do you do that? Your question about why did I choose critical traditionalism, not fundamentalism or revivalism, because I am very much, as much as I have critiques of After Virtue of McIntyre, I also think the more I read After Virtue of McIntyre, and McIntyre has seen, and he's a voice against what he thinks that what the West lost by abandoning tradition, right? McIntyre makes us aware, and Talal Asad follows on that tradition is important. And so my niche that I'm trying to find is how do we engage with tradition? Because once you are severed from tradition, you're in a whole new different space, psychological, mental and political space. So that's why I'm holding on tradition. It could be my desperation. Desperately holding on to tradition. That should be the title of my book, right?
Right. Yeah. We have about 10 minutes left. Yes, at the back. Go ahead. And then Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Professor Moosa, for making the trip from
Good to see you. He's a PhD from Notre Dame.
Wonderful.
So,
And he's not connected to the Walid Center yet? Okay, today.
I teach justice and peace, so how could we not be connected? So, thank you. I actually wanted to ask this question in a different way, but you brought in Zoran Mamdani, so maybe I'll start with the phrase he was using in his speech to his audience, city there. Ana minkum wa ilaykum.
That was very interesting.
From
That was so interesting.
Expect me to be doing everything toward you, right?
Yeah.
So that's about talking about the social responsibility of the Islamic traditional scholars, right? I heard you say just a minute ago that like holding on to the tradition and traditionalism and the study of it. And I guess I'm pushing you a little bit on the social aspect of it. How do you see the role of the traditional Islamic scholars within the Muslim community in terms of their social leadership? Or maybe to put it a little bit more aggressively, if I may, why are they lacking in doing that, right? So, and also and that's the final part, to bring it back to when you're talking about the beauty of tradition vis-a-vis the justice, right? Like what is beautiful needs also to be just. That's Waliullah's wisdom there. So I'm just thinking, if tradition is beautiful, which it is, right? Do you see scholars doing enough justice to it by not being they are vigorously part of their own community and leadership? So what's your position?
No, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Remind me to say something about Zohar Mamdani, but let me start straight out from your question. I mean, I think that the ulama tradition generally are very ill-equipped to deal with these challenges. And I come from that background. I studied in the madrasas for 6 years. And there's a time that I turned my back on that tradition. I've come back to engaging those folks. It's a very difficult conversation to have, especially when you're in America. They think that you're trying to change Islam. You are funded by the CIA. You're at a Catholic university. You're going to convert over to Catholicism. It's just a huge burden. And what I'm trying to do is so Furqan is here. He's a master's student at Notre Dame, and he's got his internship here. So, he comes from a madrasa background. He's one of the graduates of our program. So he's trying to work for those graduates because they have the best. They already have the languages. They have Urdu, they have Arabic, they have Persian, they have the skills. The quick question is that how do you put them and to understand what Ghazali says, that all knowledges are interrelated, intertwined, right? And it seems that the crisis of knowledge, and because of the colonial divide, that colonial divide is very much still sustained in these traditional quarters. they do not see a space for modern humanities and social sciences. They will take the technology. The computer is okay, and the aeroplane is okay, and the steam engine is fine. But they just don't understand that these things are all interrelated. So it's very problematic. Even in Iran, where they have, great universities, the clerics are not exposed to that complex literacy. Iran, I mean, majority of people studying at Iran universities are women. 60–70% of Iranian universities are women, and not too many of them come from a theological background. So anyway, so that was your question. So I think that's where the crisis lies. Now, because of that problem is not being addressed, people are going off and doing their own thing. So you get people like Shahrur, for instance, from engineering background, and he's now re-engineering, seeing the Quran as an engineering text, and and he's what's that? And Nasser Abu Zaid reads the text as as from a Marxist hermeneutics point of view. And okay, I mean, he's learned, but he hasn't come through a complex theological other scholarship and so on.
Yeah.
He's a literary guy, but he knows the Quran well, and he tried something, and he burnt his fingers. I mean, so the question is, to do this work, you need multiple disciplinary training. You need some credibility within the communities that you're working, and you need to do that critical work. There might be pockets in Iran and places like Egypt, maybe Morocco, where people are thinking along those lines. So for instance, I think, people like Taha Abdurrahman and his students, for instance, are beginning to provoke those kinds of questions. Abdurrahman is trained as a philosopher. He's read up a lot on Islamic philosophy, and he's trying to bring his philosophical skill to create some kind of comprehensive interpretation. While Halak is overawed by him, my great request to Abdurrahman would be to write a little bit more easily and accessible stuff. He's like 10 times worse than Derrida. And I spent half my life trying to understand Derrida. So so the thing is that so there are many challenges, and I think I agree with you about this question of what are the virtues, right? So these virtues that I recounted, these and the vices that must be avoided. One of the vices that is insularity. One of the vices is that you don't want to know what's going on in the world, and you are so and you're insecure, the insecurity. But I know from my own experience and from a whole number of other people that came from that kind of background, once they're exposed to the materials, they understand how to bring these things together and do the work. Finally, Zohran Mandani, I know him when he was a 6-year-old, and he's a great. I mean, it's just extraordinary how amazing and talented person he has become. And I was actually quite taken by his speech when he calls his wife Hayati, my life. Of course, she's Syrian, so that's the right language. It seems that they speak that. And then he also used the Arabic, ana minkum wa ilaykum. So I serve you and I'm from you. So that was very interesting how he brings in Arabic. Although I think there's a bigger Bengali population in New York, in Queens, and especially in his borough. Yeah. Although when he goes there, and he also talks to them in a few words of Bengali that he knows. So I think it's an extraordinary moment. But I don't think he holds the keys to interpreting tradition. But he can make space. He can make political space. Yeah. What you do need is political space, and I think Muslims in North America, Canada, Europe, and so on have found political space to do intellectual work. The question is that this intellectual work is not reaching the Muslim town. It's locked up in the universities or academics. So the distance between the Muslim town and the Muslim gown is still a big problem. Right. And that is a big challenge. Yeah. But And some of these things must be experimented in mosques. So there are some mosques that are doing things differently. So, for instance, Khaldūn's mosque in California, and some other places.
Yeah.
But for a long time, many of the imams and the mosques were imports, right? From somewhere in the Middle East or South Asia and so on. And it takes them 20 years to get onto the page, right? By that time, a lot of damage has been done.
And many of the mosques just are not open to having
Yeah,
dissident voices. We brought Khalid here. He was banned from every mosque.
Really,
He couldn't even speak at the mosque on campus.
really. Oh no,
So
oh no.
the problem is much deeper than you realize.
Oh,
Yeah.
would they allow me?
We'll try next time.
I'm only kidding.
Next time. Next time we come here, yeah.
I mean, I must tell you, at our mosque,
Yeah.
the imam cannot wait to give me the what's the name, the pulpit.
Oh, really?
If he can let me speak every week, it'd be okay. Because, and I tell him, but you need to earn your salary. I tell him. But there's a certain kind of openness. Yes.
Yeah. Good. Last comment or question to Jonathan.
Yeah,
And there's other.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah.
I wondered what you would say to the argument that there is no difference between tradition and history. And to a way of getting to my point here is that sometimes I have a wry, ironic thought that Fukuyama was kind of inspired by the Salafis, in the sense that Salafis seem to consider the lifetime of the Prophet as the culmination of history and of the perfection of history.
Yeah.
And so if a Salafi is listening to this, I would imagine that they would say, what are you talking about? There is no difference between tradition and history. What we're doing is we're simply letting the veto of history apply itself in its most perfected form.
That's a very interesting analogy that you just raised. Salafism and the end of history, right? Yeah. So the thing about Fukuyama's position comes out from a overweening position of power, and if I might use the word, I think misguidedness of how he reads the world, and the lack of humility.
Yeah, hubris and arrogance.
And hubris and arrogance, exactly. And I think the same applies to Salafism.
Yeah.
And history is much more complex than just a certain kind of practice over time. And that you think, but you must also think about Salafism as a manufactured tradition. It's been manufactured in order to create its size and its density in the way that it claims it is, but it's very thin, right? But the problem is, because of the rise of textualism and the lack of history, they are winning. Because all you need to do is quote a hadith, quote a Quran, and you're running, okay? And most moderns also like that, because they don't have access to the complex literacy of Sa'aduddin Taftazani and Shatibi and they don't have access to that. And even if they can read it in English, it takes a long time to understand what the heck these folks are saying, right? So it is an uphill journey. But I think the Fukuyama example is fine, but I don't think Fukuyama is doing history. Fukuyama was doing kind of political theology.
Yeah.
It was a political theology of a triumphalist political theology
Of empire.
Right.
A triumphalist political theology of empire.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Last comment to Imam Arafat.
Thank you very much. I really found it very interesting when you quoted the verse in English, which is وَإِنْ امْرُؤٌ اسْتَجَارَكَ فَأَجِرْهُ حَتَّى يَسْمَعَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ, and you, that if somebody asks your help, go ahead and help him until he hear the word of God, and give him protection. That this was related also to manners and akhlaq and ethics. And that this was not only with Islam, but this was pre-Islam. And that's where I also, of course, I remember that the Prophet himself was saying, I was sent to complete the set code of manners. So that's where I wanted to just ask you about the importance of this here in America for those imams who came from, other countries that they have been here for 30 years, and they saw the value of interfaith, but not the superficial interfaith, but the interfaith that is based on the manners and the akhlaq of those who are following other traditions, and how it is important to bring that also to other countries in the Muslim world, which are still locked there, and they didn't come here to live here, not only to visit, but to live and interact. And that's why I just wanted to ask, from your perspective, which institutions here in America who are paying attention to this and the importance of this in order to bring more reforms within the Muslim.
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure how many, who is trying to circulate that. I know you do a lot of that kind of work, Imam Arafat, because you interact with people in different spaces and bring them here, or you travel there. For the American Muslim population, I think you're having different threads to the braid that I talked about. So you have your Zaytunas, you have the various madrasas in Canada and North America. You have Bayan College. You're having things going on in Texas with Yasser Qadi and everybody. So I just recently wrote something for IIIT on introduction to a book that they published many years ago. Is not yet published, but I'm thinking about what is the next phase of Islamic studies at universities is going to be, and jobs are getting scarce, and we are graduating people, and where are those people going to go? And I'm thinking that a lot of the people who are graduating from these madrasas in North America, they want to come and study at universities. I'm sure you get everybody gets inquiries and so on, and sometimes they don't have the qualifications to do so, but I always find ways that they can maybe do a master's and then get into it and so on. So at some point, they might be used in their own institutions, and that's how you're going to see the broader circulation of learning and knowledge taking place. You could think about, what happened in Protestant Germany, for instance, how the theological schools became more and more sophisticated as they started connecting with the universities, and the universities became the places. That is a wish that I'm having on my part. I don't know how it's going to be realized. But I think the other part is also the way how we talk about Islam as unconnected, and this idea that the pre-Islam was Jahiliyyah, right? Yes, but when they use the word Jahiliyyah, they didn't mean that is tainted. Nothing is good about that. In fact, you find all the hadiths, they say there's continuity. People didn't change their diets. People didn't change their dress code. People didn't change their manners of sleeping and so on. It's just now they slept with a particular kind of reorientation of their consciousness and conscience, that there's a God who is an unseen God and so on and so forth. But many of the practice, and it is possible it took decades before they could get into that reorientation. So this idea that Islam comes and snap, then the world changes, that is just not historical. That is fantasy. So there's a lot of fantasy in this understanding of Islamic law, Islamic theology, that the elementary education that kids are taught, introductory courses at universities that are taught, and sometimes people who come from a Muslim background are very, very easily caught up into that, because they just cannot take some distance from the tradition and the political background. And sometimes you find Muslim students taking classes where there's a Muslim professor or a non-Muslim professor talking about the political complexity, and the students are so poisoned that they think, oh my God, this is trying to change Islam. Because the elementary literacy has not framed them to understand Islam as a historical tradition. It's a talisman. You see what I'm saying? So we need to end the talismanic understanding, and there should be more historical sensibility. And I think that can only come through good education.
And I find it easier here in America than the Middle East.
Oh yeah, no. The Middle East is a wonderful place, but not always
For free thinking.
And I mean, yesterday I was the guest of the president and Dr. John Borelli here, and we were talking about Nostra Aetate, and we were making all kinds of, thinking loudly about developments in different parts of the world. In the Middle East, religion is controlled by the state.
Yeah.
You can't just go in and say, I want to go and talk to people at Al-Azhar
Yeah.
about thinking about Islamic law and
Yeah.
theology. You need sign off from some minister.
That's right.
Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in
Jail
jail, exactly, or you're a suspect.
or deported.
Everywhere it's like that.
Everywhere.
I mean, the only places that you could possibly do that is still in India, Bangladesh,
Indonesia?
Indonesia. Yeah, what's that? I mean, in Malaysia, you need to have Jakim to sign off,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Someone like me can get away with it.
Yeah.
Because you have connections and you give a talk and so on and so forth. But
Anwar on speed dial.
I got Anwar on speed dial and so on, so that helps.
That helps.
But otherwise, it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's difficult, and yeah, Mustafa Akyol was thrown out.
Yeah.
A book by the guy who's in San Diego,
Ahmed Kuru.
Ahmad Kuru's book. My goodness, I mean,
he was thrown out too.
he was thrown out too. His
Yeah.
book is banned.
Yeah.
It's just terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. This is.
We could do that in India with Muslims. You couldn't talk about Vedanta without a minister approving it.
I know. I mean, yeah. So India, I mean, someone like me can go under the radar in India, right? And get away but if you come with a project,
Yeah.
like madrasa discourses, immediately, the
Alarm bells.
The alarm bells go off.
Yeah. Yeah, Ibrahim, it's been wonderful having you here today to speak about critical traditionalism and Islamic thought. We've just scratched the surface. Now that you have family in this area, we're hoping that we can piggyback
Thank you.
off on another visit to Washington, D.C. to get you to speak with us. Please join me in thanking Ibrahim.
Thank you.